So, quick introduction to the chapter on labor markets in developing countries and African countries in particular, and gendering of labor markets and labor allocation in developing countries. Let's start by briefly noting that the labor market is very important for people's livelihoods, how you earn your living, and there's a variety of work that people carry out, and we might classify the work that people carry out as work that they do at their own direction, and we often think of entrepreneurs as these kinds of this kind of work, that is, you're working for yourself, and this includes small farmers who are usually working for themselves, workers in the informal sector, small entrepreneurs who might be participating in retail trade, selling things in marketplaces, or blacksmiths or potters who have their own little small business. And then we have small and medium enterprises, which are usually classified as small businesses with about 5 employees, and so the entrepreneur is usually working alongside the employees. So we have entrepreneurs doing work, and then we have workers who do work, and workers are different from entrepreneurs in that they're at the direction of somebody else. There are workers in rural areas who are doing farming activities and other rural activities, and they're working for the farmer, the farm owner, the farm manager. There are workers in the informal sector, there are workers in the small and medium enterprise sector, and then of course there are workers in the formal sector. Most countries have a very large informal sector that might be 80% of all workers, in particular in African economies, and the formal sector might only be 20% of all workers. Many of them, of course, might be state workers working for government jobs, post office, teachers, health clinic operators, nurses, doctors, etc. So they're in the formal sector, and then there might be a formal business sector. Bank workers are typically going to be formal workers. Sometimes these formal workers get paid well in excess of everyone else, and they're sometimes referred to as the labor aristocracy. One of the definitions of being a formal sector worker often is that you're registered into a national social security scheme and thus are going to be eligible for a pension when you're older, while the informal workers will not be registered in those schemes and thus not be eligible for pensions when they get older. So that's a basic idea of who workers are. We can contrast this, entrepreneurs and workers with other kinds of systems of labor allocation, slaves, caste systems, guilds where your work is defined as a member of the guild and your work is inherited from the work of your father or the work perhaps of your mother. There's other restrictive regimes. We might think also some cases of socialism where people's labor allocation might be directed by the Socialist Party or the Communist Party in power, and a person might not have much freedom to do the work that they want to do. Rather, they're directed to do the work by the state, by a bureaucracy, by a local organization. So those restrictive labor regimes are of interest to historians. They're interest to narrow niche anthropologists, sociologists, labor economists who work on those. But on the whole, the vast majority of workers in contemporary sub-Saharan Africa the vast majority of people who are working fall into these categories of either being micro-entrepreneurs or being workers, especially in the informal sector, and then this labor aristocracy of the formal sector. So it's a really interesting question. How important is gender in the labor markets for these workers? And then how important is gender for the allocation of labor in amongst entrepreneurs or by entrepreneurs, and in particular, farm households are such an important domain where work is carried out. We might want to know how important does gender matter for the labor allocation of the members of a farm household. Is labor being allocated efficiently? Is one question we might ask. Is work being conducted in a way that isn't efficient because of some kind of gender dimension to the allocation of labor? We might also want to ask whether the labor allocation outcomes are equitable. Are they unfair? These are the kinds of questions we can ask when thinking about labor allocations and labor markets. Now, very often it's worth starting that kind of discussion by looking around for the obvious evidence of restrictions on occupations and activities that are gendered. And those restrictions might be on occupations, activities. They might be more blanket general restrictions like working outside the home. This is often called purdah. In India and northern Nigeria are places where practiced rather extensively in poor areas. And of course Saudi Arabia still has now a bit more of a social norm than a legal restriction on working outside the home. So that's an area that if you're interested in, it's well worth exploring, that extreme gendering of activities. As far as occupations, right, we can all talk to our grandparents here in the United States and ask whether occupations were gendered in the 1950s and 1960s. Were there formal rules about the gendering of occupations and certain activities? And one way to see the legal history of gender discrimination law in terms of the workplace is a steady march eroding those kinds of gender restrictions, those kinds of gendered restrictions on certain kinds of work, certain kinds of activities. So in the chapter there's a variety of examples of these in African economies settings. And finally, the chapter goes on to ask what we can learn from patterns of labor allocation. So if we're doing a large-scale survey and looking at men are doing these kinds of work, women are doing these kinds of work, there are differences, how can we understand or make sense of those patterns? And very often it's useful to think about three kinds of ways of understanding patterns. One way is this kind of restrictive, collusive institutional setting where the patterns arise by explicit direction. That is, the patterns arise because a norm, a social norm, a Nash equilibrium, as I point out, is such that women do this kind of work, men do that kind of work, or women can't do this kind of work, whereas men can do that kind of work. So that kind of collusion is going to generate certain patterns of labor activities. But comparative advantage and household maximization of utility will also generate patterns of gendered patterns of labor allocation. And this work is very much associated with Gary Becker, an economist at the University of Chicago, passed away a few years ago. He wrote a series of influential papers suggesting that in the household, if men and women developed comparative advantage in certain kinds of activities, then and comparative advantage or carrying out those activities led to learning by doing, which further entrenched comparative advantage, then it would make sense for a household to specialize and divide up tasks, and you would end up with very gendered tasks, and those might spill over into the broader world of work. And in particular, Becker argued that there were a lot of externalities in learning by doing of household work that if women, because of their typical child-rearing responsibilities, then would become homemakers, that would then lead them to be less involved in outside the home market activities, and so you would see these patterns of labor allocations and labor market performance that were strongly gendered, but they were arising, Becker argued, arising from comparative advantage and not from collusion. That was his point, that you didn't have to have discriminatory collusion in order to have gendered patterns of labor allocation. So those are two possibilities. The third possibility is somewhat of a hybrid. That is that a lot of the determinants of how labor is allocated take place within the household, and if household members, and typically we think of a household consisting of a husband and a wife, the majority of households in many parts of the world are that way, and the husband and wife have unequal bargaining power, then the resulting allocation of labor will reflect that unequal bargaining power in the household. It doesn't have to be collusive of men or institutional. It doesn't have to be a strict maximization and comparative advantage, because when you're bargaining, very often you might do things that appear to be against your own interest, but they're done in order to extract more out of the bargaining game that you're engaged in. So in a bargaining situation, you can have different kinds of patterns of labor allocations than you would in a pure comparative advantage maximization type, maximizing household welfare, joint household welfare situation. So those are kind of the three broad ways to think about labor allocation. Now, these ways of thinking about it have policy implications, and as I suggest in the book, there is a real issue. All the three approaches are valid, and they account for some part of how labor markets and time allocation work, but policymakers have to decide what characterization is most appropriate for shaping public policy. If there are constraints on the actions of women, then programs that empower women may have welfare improving effects for women, even if they appear to imply very low individual benefits from, say, improved intra-household bargaining, or even imply net costs, such as being required to attend group meetings. It's possible that programs that change norms generate externalities that escape this individual cost-benefit analysis, and one might reasonably take the position that enforcement, legislation, promotion of empowerment could have higher long-term payoffs because empowerment undermines social norms that reallocate income in an unfair and inefficient, inequitable and inefficient manner. On the other hand, if these norms have already been eroded by market mechanisms, then you might think that programs that are very expensive and try to generate empowerment may basically be very inefficient, very wasteful, because general poverty alleviation programs promoted in a gender-blind manner might be more appropriate.